So, what I'm going to be covering today is forging of some of the non-ferrous alloys and stainless steel alloys. Now, what I'm going to be covering here is not the cutlery grade stainless steels. We're going to be forging some 304 and 410. And these are both steels that are very useful in knife making and other sorts of work, but not for actually making blades. Some of the information will certainly be applicable to the forging of the cutlery stainless steels, but not identical. We'll be covering those later in a later video in more detail. What I will also be forging is architectural bronze and silicon bronze. And now, architectural bronze is actually a type of brass. It is mostly the largest alloying element in architectural bronze is zinc. Most people designate bronzes as being not zinc alloys, basically everything else. But because of the color of architectural bronze, it has this nice, golden brown hue that it ages to. It's been called a bronze for long enough that everybody just calls it bronze. So, architectural bronze is essentially, roughly 60% copper, 40% zinc. Then you get into the silicon bronze, which is actually a bronze, and it's roughly 95% copper, about 5% silicon. And they are both excellent alloys to choose if you need a forged element in a copper alloy. And I'll be covering in more detail how each one is forged, but they both have a similar characteristic of being forgeable, having perhaps not necessarily a nicer color, but definitely a different color palette than straight copper. So I, for example, will very often when I'm doing my Chinese swords, I will use that core layer on the fittings on the guard and pommel. That core layer will be architectural bronze because it's available in large sections and forges down nicely to the size I need. So we'll get into that here in a minute. So the key to architectural bronze is a very dull red color. It's worth turning off the lights in your shop or working at least in a very dim light. See if we can get that color to show up on video. This is pretty good. And as it dulls, you don't want to work too long. It's a pretty narrow working range. It's very buttery in that range. Again, you can see just that very dull red. If you get above this temperature, you get up to orange, you will get into a mushy range where there's a partial liquid constituent, and the whole thing will crumble. So if you do overheat the architectural bronze, it is important that you don't hit it. If it hasn't actually melted yet, you should be able to just let it cool and then forge it. So, just about as far as I'm going to go with this. I think it gives a good sense of the working range for the architectural bronze. And it is a very forgeable material as long as you stick in that narrow range and treat it fairly nicely. You can see I wasn't going hog wild on that. One thing to keep in mind with all of the copper alloys is they conduct heat very quickly. So they tend to heat more evenly, which is good, but they also conduct heat upwards very quickly. So things that in steel you might not have burned your fingers, in copper alloys you just might. So next up we have a piece of silicon bronze. Silicon bronze has a much broader forging range, so I don't need to be as careful. I still need to be cautious of the top end temperature, but don't need to be as careful about the low end temperature. Silicon bronze, you can work at a nice red. Basically anything below its melting temperature, you're going to be in good shape. It can be worked both hot and cold. In general, any alloyed element or any alloyed material, it's a good idea not to work in the middle. So work it cold and anneal periodically, or work it hot, and obviously it just stays annealed. But that in-between range where it's going through some crystalline transformations tends to be a little brittle. It's not generally a big deal with silicon bronze, but why take the risk? It's expensive stuff. There we go. Silicon bronze, you can work even a little hotter than this. My feeling is if it's forging nicely, why take chances? It's better to work a little bit on the cool side than it is to accidentally melt the end off your bar and have it in the bottom of the forge. So for silicon bronze, I generally work from a nicer red color, a bit brighter red color, essentially down, not quite to black, but close. So slightly different forging range than the architectural bronze. Because of the heat conduction rate, I find, or I feel like the copper alloys heat faster in the forge. And it may just be that I'm working in a narrower range, so they don't need to heat as much. You can see that I'm not babying the material as much as I did with the architectural bronze. It is a stiffer material. The architectural bronze, when you're in the right range, is really very buttery. You can see it moved very quickly for relatively little force. So you have to be cautious with it. The silicon bronze, I don't have to be as gentle with. I can essentially forge it as I would a mild steel. I just need to work it in a slightly different range than I would the mild steel. And it has a similar feel under the hammer, quite honestly. Silicon bronze tends to be a little trickier to get your hands on and a little bit more on the expensive side of the non-ferrous alloys, or at least the copper alloys. And that's because it is almost entirely copper. It tends to be 95% copper or more. So you have to be, you don't want to waste it, let's say. So it's worth working carefully, but again, it is more expensive than something like architectural bronze, but at the same time, it is also a lot more forgiving. I could probably do all this same stuff in architectural bronze, but I'd have to be more cautious in my approach. You definitely want to, if you can, maintain a slightly cooler forge temp. I've kind of got the forge running a little bit hot in order to be warmed up for the stainless alloys, which are next on the agenda. So you can see the silicon bronze, like I was saying, can forge almost entirely like mild steel, which makes it a great choice for fittings. If you want to do something that's forged a bit stronger than copper, and a little bit nicer color than copper in many ways. One thing to know about silicon bronze, however, is while it is itself a beautiful color, because it has a very nice, when you polish it up, it's a very nice rosy bronze, but it does not take patinas particularly well, so it's a little friskier that way. So that's silicon bronze. As always, feel free to ask questions in the comments. We're going to move on to the 304. 304 is probably the most available of the stainless steel alloys, and very corrosion resistant and surprisingly tough. It can also be very buttery in certain circumstances. The main complaint about 304 is that it work hardens substantially. So sometimes while you are drilling, if the drill's not perfectly sharp, you'll work harden it and instantly shred your drill. So it's a good thing to have in your arsenal, but not necessarily something you're going to want to use every day. A key to forging 304 stainless is you have to bring it up to temperature and let it soak before you start forging. Like many of the high alloy steels, it takes longer for everything to transform and, I guess in some sense, realize it's hot. So it's good to preheat, drop that in the forge. I'm going to let that get up to temperature and let it sit in there for 3 or 4 minutes, maybe even 5 minutes. The larger the stock, the longer you want it to sit in there. One thing, particularly in the 300 series stainless, it does not conduct heat nearly as quickly as mild steel. So in a large section, it takes a lot longer for that to get to the core, that temperature to get to the core. So be right back, having let that 5 minutes or so elapse. Okay, so about 5 minutes later, got nice toasty temperature. You can see I've turned the lights back on. Still feeling a little stiff under the hammer. I'm gonna go ahead, put that back in the forge a little longer. I didn't really keep track of whether it was exactly 5 minutes, so may have been not quite enough time. That's something to keep in mind, particularly with these trickier to forge materials, is pay attention to how it feels. If it's not feeling good, it seems like it's taking too much effort, it might be that a slightly longer soak time is necessary. So in this case, I don't need to worry too much about a top-end temperature. 304 doesn't have much of a limitation in that regard. Forge is very much like mild steel, similar temperature ranges. So letting it soak in the forge, not a big deal. When we get to the 410, you do need to let it soak in the forge but we also need to keep track of the top end temperature. The 400 series stainlesses, which is basically all of the hardenable stainless, even if they don't call it 400 series, so like AEBL, all of those, they're going to also essentially be a 400 series stainless. When you get into Nitro V or any of the nitrogen including alloys, I don't know. I'm not sure what how those would get designated, but basically all of the stainless alloys that do not have nickel, so they're really depending on their stainless aspect, simply from chromium oxide on the outside. Those are all essentially the 400 series stainlesses. So I think that's probably had enough time in there, and do some more forging. Now, the 304 here is definitely harder under the hammer than mild steel, but it does have a similar working range. So you can do most of the same things in 304 and 316 that you would in a mild steel. Just going to take a little longer. You're not going to want to push it quite as hard. For comparison, it feels similar to something like 5160. So it gives you at least some reference of about how stiff it should feel under the hammer. So after that initial soak time, I do not need to then soak it every time. As long as I'm not letting it get down really to black, really letting it cool all the way, I can just drop it back in the forge and bring it back up to a brighter orange and even into the yellow range and still be fine. I don't need to have it soaked. If you cool all the way, then, or even substantially down into black, yeah, you might need to let it soak again. Yeah, 304, fun to work with. I'm going to finish up the point on this in the next heat or two, and like I said, the big advantage of something like 304 is it is highly forgeable. So if you have, an architectural project or, even a blade project that requires or would benefit from a stainless steel, what needs to be a shape that would be forged, 304 is a pretty good option. I should note that it's not as forgiving as mild steel when it comes to forging in the black range. So you definitely want to make sure you don't push that part too much. Essentially, if you don't let it soak enough at the beginning, or you forge it too cold, it will split, and it will split in somewhat odd ways. So very much, like say working wrought iron, something like that, where you need to work in a specific way, work in a specific range for it to stay happy. Well, same thing here with the 304. In materials that are very temperature sensitive, it's a good idea to finish up your work on the thin parts first, because they're going to cool quickly. So here, where I want to round that up a little bit more, making sure I get my rounding done down near the tip first, so that I can, because I'm going to have a red lingering a lot longer further back. Also, away from that tip, I have less likelihood of splitting the material. So yeah, there's 304. We're going to move on to the 410. So 410 is not generally as available as 304 in a variety of sizes. I find it's often most convenient to actually buy it as round stock that I can then forge down to pretty much whatever shape I need for this, for a particular project. It's generally a lot cheaper as round stock than it is as plate or sheet or bar, simply because it's far more common as round stock. So I'm going to go ahead, toss this in the forge. The 410 does also require a bit of a soak before forging, not as much as the 304. The 300 series is what's considered to be an austenitic stainless. It's got a lot of nickel in there, and that nickel serves to just change the crystalline structure substantially. Whereas, because nickel doesn't fit nicely into the iron crystal matrix. Whereas in 410, we have no nickel, it's all chromium. It's about, I think, 14% chromium, if I'm recalling correctly. And chromium is a much better replacement for iron in the matrix. So it doesn't affect the working characteristics as much. The other thing to keep in mind is that in the 300 series, they generally fall in the chemistry of 18-8, which is 18% chromium, 8% nickel, where the 400 series, like 410 here, most of them are somewhere in the 13 to 14% chromium. There are some that are higher, but without that nickel in there, it is a much simpler alloy. They are actually somewhat less stainless than the 300 series, but part of that is also a factor of heat treat. So for the moment though, we're just going to be basically covering the forging. So I got to get this in there and get it up to temp and let it soak. The 410, while it's heating up, I should talk a little bit about the forging of it. The 410 requires a bit of a soak. Not as much as 304, but I'm also working a slightly larger section, so it's worth giving it a little bit of extra time in there. However, I do need to be more careful about my top end temperature, and I will also be more careful about my bottom end temperature. So the forging range of 410 is narrower, and this is generally true of the 400 series stainless steels. And now this is partly because in adding as much chromium as there is, if you go back and look at the iron carbon phase diagram that I talked about way back early on, the austenite zone, which you'll see is kind of a triangular area. Well, I should do it the other way so it's correct for you folks. Kind of a triangular area in the phase diagram. As you add more chromium, that actually shrinks. The strictly austenite zone shrinks. And it shrinks basically on all sides, becoming a smaller and smaller target. This is why stainless steels have very different heat treatment than most other steels. And one of the things that happens is that the actual the melting temperature, or at least kind of the mushy point for the 400 series stainless, is dropped down. So especially when you then get into higher carbon content 400 series stainless. You can really have that drop down substantially to about 2150, which is not really all that hot. So they can be very frisky steels to forge. 410's fairly forgiving, but once you get into especially the higher carbon content cutlery grade stainless, it can be very tricky to stay within the forging range. Here we go. Go for it. So you can see, forges pretty nicely at this temperature. I'm really just going for flat stock here because that's what I need in this case. Forging this down to like a 1/4 by 1 inch dimension gives me good starting material for guards, for making stainless Damascus, for fittings, things like that. So as I start to get down to this sort of temperature, that, you know, sort of bright red, dull orange, that's really the end of the forging range for the 410. If I continue, it will continue moving, and at a certain point, just shear off. Stainless steel is definitely more sensitive to temperature than most of the steels you're probably used to working. Continuing with the 410 here. Within its forging range, you can work it pretty hard. You don't have to baby it too much. But as soon as you feel it's starting to stiffen at all under the hammer, time to go ahead and get another heat. This is another one of those cases of it's expensive enough that it's worth babying the material a little bit and not ruin it. I'm going to take just one more heat, just show a little bit more of the forging on this. One key thing to know about 410 is when you are done forging, it's a good idea, get it up to a nice orange, quench it in oil. It does not really harden, but it does harden somewhat. And then do a good long subcritical anneal on it. If you do not do that, it can be absolute bear to machine in any way. If you do go ahead and do that harden and then harden, at least quench and subcritical anneal, you'll have much better working characteristics for machining. It also does leave it in, intriguingly, a somewhat more stainless state. In the cutlery grade stainless steels, sort of the bane of your stain resistance is chromium carbide. 410 has very little carbon. It can still form some chromium carbide. So by heating it up to a good temperature and dissolving all that carbide, then quenching, you are allowing essentially the subcritical anneal stage to temper that out entirely. You get a very fine dispersed carbide as opposed to the very chunky carbides that chromium likes to form. So it's a good thing to follow that step if you're going to be doing any kind of machining on this afterward. Machining, filing, pretty much anything. So it's a good finishing step for your forging. Ta-da! So I'm going to leave it there for today. Hopefully this has been helpful, and you know, as always, if you have any questions about further details, go ahead and post them in the comments. We try to do a good job keeping up with those things. So good luck foraging out there.